Good afternoon, I'm Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre. We exist to make the positive case for politics and public service. We try and do that in three key ways. First of all, we do research. We study the relationship between the public and their politicians. We also run a variety of different internship and development programmes designed to break down the barriers that people face accessing public life. And we also do advocacy work with events like today's, amplifying the research and recommendations of experts in their field. We are delighted to be joined by Tryl and Conleth from More in Common, who are going to present the findings of their recent report, Democratic Repair, What Britons Want from Their Political System. More in Common is an international initiative set up in 2017 to build societies that are stronger, more united, and more resilient to the increasing threats of polarisation and social division. Luke and Conleth have taken the pulse of British democracy, and over the next 20 minutes, they'll tell us not just how disengaged we are, but who is disengaged and what can be done about it. Then we'll go to your questions for the remainder of our 60-minute session. So if you'd like to ask our experts a question, please submit it in the Q&A box on your screen, and that will come through to our team here at the John Smith Centre. This event is recorded so that we can make it available to people to watch in their own time and to share it through our networks here at the University of Glasgow and further afield. Luke and Conleth, welcome to the Centre. We're delighted to hear more about your work.
Thanks, Kezia, for that, and I'll just share my screen. And it's great to be here and to see so many of you joining today. So over the last year, Luke and I and our colleagues have been speaking with dozens of Britons in focus groups across the country and with thousands of others through our polling to take the pulse of British democracy, as Kezia said, and to see how strong and resilient it has been given the challenges of the last decade of referendums and elections and the pandemic, among many other challenges. So the broader context that we find is one of both resilience and urgent need for repair. So most Brits are satisfied with democracy, most are attached to democratic principles, and most reject the non-democratic alternatives. And all of that stuff is great. But today, what Luke and I want to focus on is really where repair is most needed and what we can actually do about that. So over the past year, we've seen that need for repair grow even stronger. So most Britons felt that our system was rigged to serve the rich and influential at the start of last year, but by the end of last year, November, just after the MP's sleaze scandal, we saw that grow even further. And when we look abroad to the impact of this in countries across Europe, which we've just polled in November and December, we see that Brits are the second most likely to feel that their country is rigged. And we'll see that this was even before Partygate, so after Partygate, this is likely to have grown even further. But it's not just a feeling that the system is rigged. There's also a broad sense across the British public that the elites look down on them, that they don't respect them. That's true for both the government and for civil servants. And also that the elites are out of touch. So we see here majorities of Britons think that mayors, civil servants, journalists, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are all out of touch with the difficulties that they experience in their day-to-day lives. Key to this kind of broader context and this broader feeling of not being respected by the elite is this gap between the Britain we have today and how people see that as divided, intolerant and chaotic, and the Britain that we want for tomorrow, which is compassionate, honest, fair, polite and democratic. And that gap between those two worlds is key to a lot of the driving of the cynicism and pessimism and frustration that we find among the British public. Now, Luke will talk more about what we can actually do about this, but the lens through which More in Common thinks about this is through our 7 segments, our typology that was launched in 2020. So this was a way of grouping Britons not by their politics or their demographics, but by their core beliefs, their values and their social psychology. So on the right of the screen here, you'll see the 5 elements that we think are highly predictive of many views and is a better way of understanding British society. For the purposes of strengthening our democracy, there are three groups in particular who are important to see progress being made in our democracy. Those are disengaged battlers, loyal nationals, and disengaged traditionalists. Now, I'll go into those groups in a minute and tell you a bit about them, but they share a broad series of characteristics when it comes to democracy. All of them have lower trust in UK election results. All of them are more open to non-democratic alternative means of governance. And they also think that we need a rule-breaking leader to fix the problems of the country, which is a key measure of authoritarianism and openness to populism. They are more ambivalent about the removal of electoral or democratic safeguards and protecting minority rights. And they have weaker levels of concern when it comes to accountability in public life. So that's the group that we want to work with in order to strengthen our democracy, and particularly to understand them first in order to be able to see how we can build the case for a stronger democracy. For disengaged battlers, they are a group who are only getting by. They blame the system for its unfairness. They think in a systematic way rather than an individualistic way. They do value equal rights for everyone, but they have this very, very strong belief that the system isn't working. The Loyal Nationals are a patriotic group. They are the group that switched most from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party at the last election. They feel threatened, they feel left behind, they feel that the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and they feel that our leaders are prioritising other groups of people over them. So that's key to their frustration with the democratic system. And disengaged traditionalists, unlike disengaged battlers, they see things from a very individualistic lens rather than a societal lens. And their disengagement stems from distrust of others rather than distrust of or frustration with the elites. It's very important for this group that rules are followed by individuals and that rules are enforced by authorities, but their disengagement comes from an ambivalence or that they have better things to do rather than an anger or frustration. So that's the nature of disengagement and low trust groups in British democracy. So bringing these groups up closer to today, whenever we asked about voting intention in between June 2020 and November 2021, we see a change in these groups when it comes to that they won't vote or that they don't know who to vote for. And that was a 5% increase across the board, but you can see on the November 2021 graph that all of the low trust groups that I've just talked about have more than a third of people who don't know who to vote for or who tell us that they won't vote in the next election. So what we see here is that the risk of a resurgence in populism in the UK will come from the ability of populists to win these groups. And in focus group discussions that we have with these groups regularly, they tell us that they're looking for an alternative outside of mainstream politics. And that is where the populist opportunity is and where the risk of further populism growing. Now, there is one question to ask before we move on to the impact of the Partygate and Sleaze scandal. Is disengagement always a bad thing in British democracy and in democracy in general? And our findings suggest that if we want to strengthen democracy in the UK, we should focus on Britons being satisfied with their democracy rather than their participation or engagement in democracy. And we see this best by looking at the progressive activists who are down on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. They are the most engaged group and the least satisfied group. So they break this link between engagement and satisfaction. And so what our recommendation to the democracy sector and to the politicians that we talk with is that you need to focus on people being satisfied with democracy rather than people being engaged with democracy. And we learned a lot about the nature of engagement through the course of this exploration. And they're just that many people are not disengaged because they're dissatisfied with what's going on, but because they're generally happy with what's happening. They're happy with the status quo and they want to focus on other things. So we came up with two terms to describe these dynamics. One is no point disengagement, and the other is no time disengagement. So on the latter one, the no time disengagement, that's simply where people don't get involved because they have better things to do. They prioritize other things in their life. No point disengagement is the more worrying one, where people opt out because they feel that the system is broken and rigged and it's not working for them. And it's that no point disengagement that will have grown as a result of Partygate that Luke will talk about now.
Thanks, Conleth, and thank you for having us to present on this. We're always very keen at More in Common that our research isn't just a sort of static document that sits on a shelf, and particularly when it comes to something like attitudes to democracy. We know that current events influence how people feel quite strongly. So as Partygate has unfolded, we've been tracking attitudes and looking at where the public are on what's happened, what they think about it, how it's affecting their views of democracy more widely. And I think the first thing to say is that there is a lot of frustration and anger that we find across groups, focus groups that we've done recently. It very much plays into that sense that Conleth talked about, the idea that the system is rigged, that there is one rule for a sort of political elite class and one rule for other people, ordinary people, and that politicians are in the business of setting rules that they know they have no intention of following themselves. And that's really important when we start to think about rules and regulations and nudging behaviour changes more widely, which I'll go on to talk a little bit about at the end. What I think is quite sobering is that whilst people are angry and frustrated, what didn't really come across from the people that we spoke to was surprise. There was a sense that, well, of course, something like this was going to come out. This is just what politicians do. We're used to them doing this type of thing. Lots of people made the connection between the very different lifestyles that they believe that politicians hold compared to their own lifestyle. So we would get people saying things like, well, of course, that this is what they do. They go to these champagne parties and they weren't going to stop doing it during lockdown, or they live these very luxurious, lavish lifestyles. Of course, they were going to carry on doing it. And I think that's really important because, whilst it is, certainly not true of most MPs that we know and work with, or MSPs, AMs, that perception is quite deeply rooted. And then I think the second point that I'd make is that whilst there is this anger and frustration that comes across, there's also a sort of sense of balance as well. So the idea that all politicians get up to this stuff, in some people inspires a bit of a, well, it's comical. This is the sort of thing they do. They're all buffoons. What more should we expect? Some people, and I will say it's a minority, but some people we've spoken to think it's a little bit overblown, Partygate, and there is certainly a residual group of people who give the Prime Minister credit on Brexit, and in particular, as it links back, this isn't just about party politics, it's the sense of delivering the promise on Brexit, that Brexit got done and it moved away from that chaos, and that is still resonant for some people. It's less than it was, say, 18 months ago, but it's still there, and some credit on the pandemic as well. But I think what is also clear, and what has really cut through with people, and why I think this scandal is sort of tangibly different when you talk about it with people, is this sense that everyone has a story, and they can talk about their own experiences in lockdown and contrast it with this perception, rightly or wrongly, that the Prime Minister, that Number 10, that others were all getting up to something else as well. And I think, those contrasting those images of the Queen sat alone at Prince Philip's funeral with what they believe politicians were up to really has hit home for lots of people. That said, again, when you ask people, would Keir Starmer or the Labour Party have done this? People say, well, yeah, they all do it. That's what every party does. So for lots of people that we're speaking to, they're not making this a partisan thing. Some people are, and on the next slide, we've got some of our polling which looks at that, but lots of people aren't making that partisan link. It is very much a pox on all your houses. This is what politicians do. So this, if we just flip back, Conleth, to the summary slide, this polling we did prior to Partygate, but after the Owen Paterson scandal came out. This was the Radnocks and sort of second job scandal. And again, I think what was really sobering, and this comes out in both the quant and the qual, is that 83% of Britons already thought that MPs were corrupt before the scandal. For lots of people, that particular scandal was just confirmation bias. Lots of Britons think that goes across the two political parties. But what that doesn't mean, and this applies both to the second jobs issues, but also to Partygate as well, that there's no impact. It's not that people have just priced it in and therefore they move on. Instead, it just makes them, it confirms that bias just a little more. It's that sort of steady erosion of people's trust and faith in democracy. And I guess you can get to a stage where you sort of think, but, wasn't it ever thus? And actually, isn't it a bit healthy if people are skeptical of people in charge? When have politicians ever been popular? What's interesting is we find that it's of a different tenor now. And the way that it comes out is when people start to think about big societal challenges. So we do a lot of work as well as around democracy. We do a lot of work on climate. As one of the issues perhaps most likely, if it's handled badly, to cause polarization in the years ahead. And what's really interesting is that you see people make that direct line from not trusting politicians to not trusting them to lead the way on net zero. In fact, 57% of Britons think that if politicians are going to make money on environmental issues, that isn't a price worth paying to reach net zero. And we hear people in focus groups often say, oh, well, all the new contracts for the renewable stuff, that's all going to be going to their mates, isn't it? And also, similarly to the pandemic, we're going to be expecting people, when it comes to the climate transition, to make some really significant behavioral changes in their lives, to make sacrifices. And the built-in view, exacerbated by Partygate, is we're going to be asked to do this stuff, but those in power aren't. And we've got a bit more breakdown on how our different groups and our different segments see politicians. What's really interesting is that the groups that are most likely to think that politicians were corrupt and to have been most excised by recent events are that loyal national group that Conleth talked about. That's that sort of a group who are quite socially conservative, but economically quite left-wing, quite concerned about inequality. Disengaged battlers, those people who are really struggling and see what they perceive as others, enjoying lavish lifestyles, and that democracy isn't working for them. And then progressive activists as well. And I think with progressive activists, what you tend to find with that group is a bit more of a sort of partisan disposition to how they view the world. So that's probably reflected here as well. And if we just go on to the next slide, you see that very clearly in which parties are the most corrupt. So the progressive activists, who are the most left-leaning group, I think only 3% of progressive activists vote Conservative. 67% of them think that the Conservatives are most corrupt. But I think most damning is actually that graph at the far end, which shows that for most people between those two major Westminster parties, they think that they are both equally corrupt as well. And then if we just move on here, I just wanted to hover just on this quote for a second, because I think it sums up what I was trying to say about that link that people make between lack of trust in democracy and lack of trust for our leaders pushing us to make those changes and big decisions across society. This was a quote from a group that we did during COP, where we got people from London, Glasgow, and Blythe together, and it was quite a common sentiment, this idea that actually, do I trust these people to lead us on this journey? So finally, and I want to move over to questions, what sort of things can we do to resist this? Because we want to be solutions focused. We want to look at actually how we can build and move our democracy forward. And through our focus groups and pollings, we identified a series of recommendations for how to strengthen British democracy. And I think the most important one, and it sounds obvious, but is that people have to see democracy delivering for them in their everyday lives. People have to feel it's worthwhile being part of a democracy, because as Conleth highlighted, for a significant minority, they feel that actually it might be worth trading away democratic rights for more economic security and a better future for their family. So that means that when it comes to things like the levelling up agenda, obviously is very topical today, people really want to see those improvements in their everyday lives. They want to see their local high street, which they think has been neglected, getting better. They want better local schools. They want the park round the corner not to be covered in glass so that they can take their kids to it again. It's much less about the kind of grand projects and metrics that politicians like to talk about, and more about that every day. When it comes to participation, as Conleth said, most people actually aren't hankering to become more involved. They have their own lives. They want to get on with them. What they want is a sense that decisions are being made at the right level. So decisions about their local area should be made locally. And they want opportunities to, again, be consulted in the things which matter to them most. Most people won't go to a citizens' assembly and don't want to go to a citizens' assembly. And they sort of see climate change, for instance, as something that politicians should be dealing with centrally. But they are interested in local planning decisions, what's happening with local schools, and want to be able to have a say there. So it's about meeting Britons on their own terms, rather than expecting everyone to be the kind of hyper engaged group that we might want them to be. We think that the current review in Westminster of the MP's Code of Conduct is actually a really important opportunity, and we hope that it goes further than is currently proposed, because there is something about accountability and it being seen that when you break the rules, there are real consequences, that you don't just either A, again slightly topically, throw other people under the bus, but B, you yourself face consequences in the way that they would. And again, when people talk about this, if they relate it to their own lives, what's interesting about Partygate is just as much as people talk about breaking pandemic rules, a lot of people sort of expressed bafflement that there was just booze in the office. And they said, if I were drinking on the job, I'd lose my job. Is that what these politicians do? So there's something there, that disconnect between consequences for them and for others. I think there is clearly also something about not trashing political life. I think, there can be a tendency to engage in a sort of race to the bottom in order to portray your opponents as the worst and the bad people. And this, what we're not saying is that politics needs to become all kumbaya. And in fact, actually, they'd be dangerous to that too, if there was seen to be a sort of cozy consensus. But there's a difference between disagreeing on the merits of a policy and constantly questioning motives. And I think that particularly applies to how politicians engage on social media as well. At the moment we have this debate started by the Prime Minister on the Savile stuff. That sort of thing is just toxic to political discourse, because it fuels fringes on one side who believe this stuff. Other people are just disgusted it's been raised. There's no need to it. And then finally, these last couple of points, more representative political candidates. Lots of people say this. I know this isn't particularly revolutionary, but I think the really important thing to stress there is it's not, is that people want to see both diversity in reflecting the makeup of Britain, but people also want to see diversity in terms of people who are properly rooted in their communities, and more opportunities for people to feel like, my community is being represented by someone of the community rather than someone put into the community. Link democracy to place. I think that ties in with the idea of, that kind of meeting people in their everyday lives, opportunities for local involvement, media and social media I've mentioned. And then finally, just on talking about democratic safeguards, there is clearly work to be done with a minority of the population about why things like democracy, human rights matter. And I think we need to do a better job of talking to people on their own terms. So I've grouped the disengaged traditionalists that Conleth mentioned. For them, what's most important, they get the policy issue that exercises them a lot is small boats and the channel, because it goes against their sense of order and control that they want to have for the country. Now, obviously, human rights and democracy and those rules are what help to give us that system of order and control. And we need to do a better job of talking about it in those terms, rather than more abstract sort of philosophical terms, which actually don't resonate with these groups and make them more likely to question their value. So that is everything from us. And I think I'm now handing back over for questions.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Conleth, for a really fascinating oversight of the work that you've done. One of the things I really like about this report is, whilst it sets out the extent of the problems that we're faced, it also devotes an awful lot of time to potential solutions and what we can do about it. And I will use a lot of our time around the Q&A to focus on those solutions and exploring what that might look like in detail. But before I get to that, I do want to talk about the problems just a little bit more. And I wonder, Conleth, if I can start with you. I was very struck at the start when you're talking about the 7 different segments. You talked about loyal nationals, disengaged traditionals, and disengaged battlers. By the sum totals of the population numbers you put next to those, that makes up 47% of the country. That's huge, right? I mean, how big a problem is this? And is it as big a problem in every part of the country, or do you see certain geographic concentrations that you can talk to?
So it is the problem is stark. 47% of the population largely feels these ways. It should be said that our research into these groups is because they are more likely to. So it's not that every single loyal national or every single disengaged traditionalist or every single disengaged battler holds these terms, but in comparison to the rest of the population or the other segments, these are the people where there is the highest risk. So the picture isn't only of a need for urgent repair, but also of resilience of institutions and of the kind of British public's ability to balance. Whenever we did the regional analysis or the national analysis, so we didn't have Northern Ireland in the sample, but we did have England, Scotland and Wales. There weren't huge differences in any of the views that were there. There were some minor differences, and there were some people when we talked in focus groups that had different views on the pandemic response when we did the focus groups in March 2021, and then since then as well with various people. But there is one of kind of the general picture applies across the board, and the segments that we've developed here provide more nuance sometimes than a national or regional analysis would provide, because we can understand what's behind that as well. Not only the fact that people have different leaders, which obviously when you ask about views of the management of the pandemic, for example, there will be different views when it comes to the First Ministers in Scotland and Wales versus the UK government in Scotland and Wales, and also with local responses regionally within England. But more generally, when you kind of zoom out a bit on the state of democracy, we see relatively stable views across the board.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I appreciate the typology behind the segments that you've come up with is relatively new, but are you clear that this problem's getting worse? Like what evidence can you point to that we're becoming increasingly distrustful within these particular groups?
So the evidence is definitely getting worse that we are becoming more frustrated with the elites, and you see that in the rigged system that we talked at the start, and also we polled about, are things going in the right direction or the wrong direction, and people feel that things are going definitely in the wrong direction. There is stability in when we ask people about whether they trust other people. So our trust in horizontal trust rather than vertical trust has been relatively stable. There's been a minor increase, but it's within the margin of error, so it's not yet an increase as such over 2021 when it comes to most people can be trusted. And there are some kind of more positives when it comes to division. So now that the Brexit years are behind us, the number of people saying that this is the time where we are the most divided we've ever been has fallen slightly. So there are some kind of positives to be taken in that. But this trust in political leadership and in the system in itself has definitely fallen, and it's worse than it's been in any time over the data that we have since the start of the pandemic.
Thank you. And Luke, I'm going to come to you with the first two questions from our audience. One was sent in advance and one's just been submitted live about the role that the news media play. First of all, in perceptions of democracy, but also their role in restoring trust in politics.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's a really good point. So I think if you just take a step back, when we look at, we also do a lot of work looking at people's attitudes to media in general. And what's really interesting is the most common response that we get back, both in our polling and getting focus groups, is that in lots of cases, the media are actively fueling division in society. And there's a sort of increasing disengagement from mainstream media as well because of this, which has two negative consequences. A, it means that people are sort of switching off, and you hear people say that I just can't watch it anymore, it's too depressing. But also it means that people start to look elsewhere for alternative sources of news and information. And what we're starting to see, particularly through the segmentation, is people drifting towards places that reinforce existing biases. So people on more progressive ends going to more left-wing sources of news, people on the right drifting the other way as well. So it's actually not only are our sort of media organizations, you know, sort of signing their own death warrant, I guess, through appearing overly divisive, they're driving people into the hands of other groups who are more likely to foment division in society as well, which is really tricky. The one positive that we find, and I think this is, you know, we've got to find a way to better support this group, is local media. People have much more faith in local newspapers, and they actively they will say, you know, I read my MP's update column in the local newspaper, it told me what they were doing, you know, and just like people have more faith in their local MP than they do with politicians writ large, they have more faith in local media than they do nationally. So I think that's really important. And I think one of the particular challenges that we face is around the BBC and the role of the BBC, because what our polling broadly finds is that if you are, most people think the BBC is relatively balanced, but if you're on the left, you tend to think the BBC is biased towards the right, and if you're on the right, you tend to think the BBC is balanced towards the left, and that's a real challenge for the BBC as a public broadcaster, and in, you know, doing that role which they, I think, try to do, and try to do a good role of making sure we have a common version of the truth, is very difficult in these polarized times. So I don't underestimate the challenge that media organizations face.
Thanks, Luke. We got a little bit of feedback on your mic there, so I wonder if it might help next time that we move your mobile phone just a wee bit further away from the computer, see if that makes a difference. But we could hear what you said, so please be assured that you were heard loud and clear in that regard. Conleth, I'd like to turn now maybe to the solutions focus part of the report, and I'm going to try and weave some of the questions that we've got from the audience into that. And starting at the top of your list of recommendations, you talk about democracy needing to deliver for people and how levelling up is a big part of that agenda. You've also talked about the closer decisions are taken to people, the more likely they are to like them or to trust them. I've certainly seen evidence in the past that says you're more likely to trust your local councillor or your MP if you've met them. There's that kind of humanising effect. Where does the levelling up agenda that we're going to hear in our nightly news bulletin tonight fit into this? And what about devolution? Is this a case for more devolution?
So I think that the levelling up agenda is an opportunity to deliver for people's everyday expectations, and particularly for these groups that we mentioned already. So these are the groups who feel most left behind, who feel that their area has been neglected for a long time, and particularly the loyal nationals in that who believe more than most groups that that their area has been left behind, that the elites have forgotten them. And that's in communities across the country, mainly in the North and Midlands, and also in Scotland and Wales. But there are communities in every part of the United Kingdom which have those long-standing feelings of neglect. And the Levelling Up agenda provides an opportunity to reset that and to show these groups in particular that lives can be made better. What we published another briefing paper on this 10 days ago, and our argument there was that in order for that to work, in order for the Levelling Up agenda to restore trust in democracy's ability to deliver and in the government's ability to deliver, it needs to focus on people's everyday expectations. So when it comes to levelling up, that means parks and green spaces, it means high streets, it means crime and antisocial behaviour, and giving a sense of purpose back to places, because there are many communities in the past who felt that they had a stake in the national story. And now, due to the changes in the economy and the centralisation of power and money in London, they've been left out from that broader national story of success. So the Levelling Up agenda is a chance to reset that. Devolution is a clear part of levelling up, and we saw in the briefings about the paper that devolution is going to play a big part in the government's plan around levelling up. And obviously in Scotland and Wales, and where I am in Northern Ireland, we have a longer standing experience of structured devolution in a way that regions in England, who will be the focus of this new devolution. But what devolution can do is it can bring decision makers closer to the people, and people in focus groups and in the polling think that decision making will become better whenever decision makers are living in those communities where those decisions have an impact. There's a feeling at the minute that decisions are taken in London and they're far removed, so they don't know how to make the right decisions, and they also don't need to live with the consequences of those decisions. Our word of caution on this is that most people aren't terribly interested in the metrics or the mechanics of devolution. So politicos on this call maybe, and we spend our days scrolling on Twitter looking at the next devolution plan from another think tank or civil society organisation. And that's great for debate, but the public aren't there. They don't care about the deep mechanics of devolution. They want it. They will judge its delivery on what they see in their everyday lives. And when it comes to the Levelling Up agenda, I mean, a lot of the discussion has focused in recent days on metrics, and those metrics are important for policymakers, but for the public, those metrics don't matter. They want to see change that they can judge with their own eyes and that they can feel in their everyday lives as well.
And look, you're going to have to forgive me because this sounds very critical of the recommendations. It's really not. It's because we like them that we want to test them rigorously to see how robust they are. But when it comes to the recommendation around what meaningful engagement and citizen participation looks like, and the idea that we've got to meet people on their own terms, is that not just a pursuit for the middle classes? I mean, I've always had a worry about deliberative democracy techniques like citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies that feel like they're for people other than the people who could perhaps benefit from them.
I think that's a really good challenge that you've made. And actually, it's one of the reasons why in the report, we do try and steer away from too much of a focus, particularly on events which often aren't appropriate for people who are time poor. It's not just about people's level of interest and engagement. It's about the actual ability to take part in these events, which is why what we're trying to suggest in the report is take more decisions, as Conleth said, empower people in local communities who, experience the consequences of decisions, to take those decisions. And that therefore means that you don't necessarily have to be in a, 4-hour local council meeting debating X, but that your local councillor who's responsible for it lives down the road from you. And that by when you want to speak to them to address something locally, that gets something done. And we think that type of engagement is much more meaningful than expecting everyone to want to turn up to a citizens' assembly. I suspect lots of people on this call love talking about politics and policy and political issues and do it both in their day job and outside of it. For most people, you're entirely right, that isn't the majority view. And actually, and I think you were getting to this with your question, can also lead to quite a distorted sense of people's priorities, because of the people who self-select to go to these events. So one of the interesting things about our segmentation, for instance, is that the progressive activist group are much more likely to share political content on social media, to turn up to a protest or a rally, to do that sort of things. Other groups aren't, and they can actually almost find that kind of very active style of democratic engagement quite alienating from them. So it's much more about rooting in community, making people feel like they have access to their elected representatives when they want to, and that decisions that have been taken for their community are being informed by them and their life experiences.
Thanks. Look, I've actually got 2 follow-up questions for you based on audience questions connected to what you've just said. So I'm going to stick with you and then come to Conleth in a second or two with one of the other recommendations. But just sticking with what we're discussing here, can you tell us a little bit about what role referendums might play in increasing democratic participation? It's not something that we're used to in the United Kingdom, but it's a very common practice, and in Ireland and in many other European countries. Do we want to start a culture of having more social policy based referendum questions more often in the United Kingdom? Is that going to help?
I think our view is certainly when we do the focus groups and talk to people, there is an overwhelming appetite for more referenda. And I think that particularly because of the experience of how those referenda have been conducted. So people, when we talk to them about the 2014 referendum, people will talk about the kind of, quite openly about the divisive impact of that, the fact that, the arguments that they had, the fact that it led to this increase in tension. The Brexit referendum in 2016, similarly, is just not an experience that lots of people are willing to rush to repeat. And I think, again, most people will sort of say, these aren't things that I can just decide with a yes, no. Where we think perhaps it's worth exploring referendum more is when it comes to, again, more local issues. Issues which are about, for instance, approving a local regeneration plan. That's the sort of thing where people can meaningfully engage. It directly affects their area. There's more opportunity to get up to speed on the views, and models like that have been trialed much more successfully. I think, in general, referenda lend themselves to issues which aren't by their nature polarizing. Because, whether it's Brexit or the independence referendum or even the AV referendum, they were very highly charged affairs. And I don't think anyone would agree that they were the best exercises in democratic engagement and deliberation. Whereas when you remove some of that heat and are dealing with issues which are on the ground affecting people's local area, you're much more likely to get nuanced engagement there as well.
And just finally on this topic, before we move down the list of recommendations, interesting question here about the competing interests of the groups that we're talking about. So given that the required engagement is different across the 3 identified groups, how do we go about engaging with each group's concerned? Because what resonates with one might actually repel the other. Do
you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll do that. So I think it's a really good challenge, and it's why and very much we advocate meeting these groups on their own terms, and they do all have kind of different issues. So as I mentioned, the disengaged traditionalists, particularly motivated by that concern for order, rules of the game. Disengaged battlers, it's economic security. For loyal nationals, it's that sense of feeling a bit like a stranger in their own land. And so you won't please all of these groups through a sort of manifesto. There isn't a manifesto which sort of will appeal to them with a series of policy positions. But what unites all of those groups is this sense that the system isn't working for them, is the sense that their local area has been left behind, has been neglected, that actually, if we ask them about kind of local government, even in lots of cases, it doesn't really, they don't have respect for them, the people who are in charge don't address their concerns. So I think it's about that demonstration of visible progress. What unites all those groups is, again, when you talk to them, is they want to see their local high street improve. They want to see their local parks improve. They want better schools. So it's that investment both in the community and in public services goes right across them. And the common thread is that notion that democracy delivers for me, that it's worth being part of this democratic system.
Thank you. And Conleth, just moving down the list of recommendations, there's one there about strengthening and enforcing codes of conduct, which feels like a really live issue in the current political climate. I wonder, though, how you can make that argument about the importance of the rules and saying rules have consequences when political tensions are as high as they currently are, right? So at the moment, if somebody were to demand for the resignation of a leading political figure, it feels politically charged rather than a very practical response to a rule being broken. So how do you progress that argument to be about the integrity of the rules rather than just a little bit more of classic political cut and thrust?
Well, I think I'll answer this with the focus groups. So we talk about this regularly in the focus groups, and you hear a regular refrain that no one resigns anymore, and people used to resign, and whenever they did something wrong, they used to resign. And part of that, I mean, it's a two-way responsibility, part for opposing political leaders or for the opposition in any of these contexts. It's only calling for resignations when there has been a serious rule break, because if you call for a resignation at every single moment, then it makes it less likely that people are going to resign, and it makes it more likely that it looks politically charged. So whenever there is a resignation, when there's a resigning matter, then call for it only there. And then it's for those who set the culture in government or in political parties to enforce the rules. So if we say that something is a resigning matter, and if the rules are broken, and if investigations have found that the rules have been broken, then you need to resign, because otherwise you're doing damage to the institution. And ultimately, on any of these questions, these institutions are bigger than any one political career. And we need to get back to that there are some things that are more important than the short-term political careers of politicians, and that the institutions must survive beyond that. It's more important for democracy.
Okay, I'm just going to stick with you for the next one as well, Conleth, if that's okay. Just a reminder to our audience, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got 5 recommendations to work our way through. You don't have to ask a question linked to those recommendations. You're welcome to ask a question about anything, and you can do so by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, I'll keep channeling through the list of questions I have for our 2 guests here. The next one in the report is about democratic safeguards and talking about them in a way which really resonates with people. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what you mean by a democratic safeguard, because when I read that, I think of maybe needing to do something quite drastic very soon about the proliferation of fake news. So we're talking about the rising of these alternative media sources, where people are getting their news from, and how quickly a rumour can spread like wildfire around the internet. We've seen a very clear example of that in the last 40 hours in the political bubble as well. What are democratic safeguards, and what role does fake news play in that?
So I think maybe we'll separate the questions into one on the democratic safeguards from what the British people told us, and then we'll address the fake news one. On the democratic safeguards, this is particularly worrying when it comes to respect for minority rights. So that's both political minorities and ethnic minorities. So we polled on those, and the question was asking about when rights of the majority clash with rights of the minority, whose rights should be trumped, or should everybody be considered, or should minority rights take a back seat? And there were worrying levels of minority rights should take a back seat among the 3 groups that we mentioned, the Loyal Nationals, Disengaged Battlers and Disengaged Traditionalists. Less on the Disengaged Battlers on this, but more broadly, these groups had less support, or had more support for the idea that minority rights should take a back seat. And our kind of learning for that, and that to talk about democratic safeguards in a way that resonates with people, is that whenever we campaign around the Human Rights Act or around rights in general, we need to do it in a way that taps into the values of these groups and not the progressive values of the lawyers who are fighting these cases in court, or of the kind of elite on Twitter who love talking about human rights. But the fact is that they're already convinced that they know of the value of human rights, of the value of protections of minority rights. We need to bring these low trust groups with us. And so part of that is having a pride, is kind of building pride in those rights. So, the Human Rights Act, when it was introduced, was about bringing rights home. There's something that we need to build an argument and a campaign and a movement around these rights are intrinsic to the identity of people who live in this country and are really important, and we should be proud of them. And there's a kind of patriotic case to be made on these rights for loyal nationals in particular. For the disengaged traditionalists, it's about, as Luke was saying before, that order, that the Human Rights Act and the rights-based legal system and the rule of law give us order in society. And so it's finding those messages and campaigns that work there. On fake news, we see that people want social media companies to enforce rules whenever they're broken. So there is an opportunity there, definitely, where there's a kind of broad consensus among people that social media companies are more a force for bad than a force for good in our societies, and that whenever rules are broken, we need to tackle those. And we'll be doing more work on social media across our countries in the time ahead. But what we can see is that in order to tackle fake news, there needs to be that kind of clear rules-based approach, as well as better political leadership. So in the example that you mentioned at the start of the last few days and the fake news around that's an absence of political leadership, and it's kind of a scorched earth strategy to try and do anything to save one person's political career. That's bad for democracy, and the fake news here is a risk among these low trust groups in particular.
Thank you. And Luke, the next recommendation is about avoiding trashing in political life. And this is a real favourite here at the John Smith Centre. We think about this a lot and we talk about this a lot. We like the idea of learning to disagree better as a country. Disagreeing is important. It's a fundamental functioning part of a democratic system. But the tone of our debate is definitely soured. And there are lots of reasons for that. There are really very many solutions about how to turn it around, though. I wonder, what do we need to do to improve the tenor of our political debate beyond just asking politicians to be nicer to each other? Because that's not going to work.
No, absolutely not. And it follows entirely on from what Conleth was just talking about on the role of social media. And I guess what can be slightly depressing is you get people bemoaning that sort of tone on social media, and yet they remain sort of popular sources of news where people are more likely to follow the goings on of politics on Facebook than they are on the 6 or 10 o'clock news now. So there is definitely something, I often say, if More in Common could have 2 wins, one would be, actually making sure that the levelling up agenda delivers for people. And the second would be getting Facebook and Twitter to change their algorithms to not just promote the stuff which encourages division. But I do think there's a danger that sort of lets politicians and lets political parties wash their hands to say that's just the climate that we're in now. Actually, they are masters of their own destiny, and what we'd like to see is political parties in particular taking much more action when it comes to disciplining candidates, party members, where they engage in very personal abuse. And I think there have been some steps forward there as well. I think some of the stuff which Chris Bryant has been proposing around adding to those Nolan principles for public life, adding respect to that actually matters, and having that something that we actually hold people accountable for there are consequences to not being respectful. Because I think the problem is that our side who advocate respect, people being nicer, more tolerance of opposing views, we're often then not very good about holding people's feet to the fire on that, and people who are the bomb throwers are the people who then get away with it and don't face any consequences. So there's that. And then I think there's a third point, which is we need to find ways, and I know you already do good stuff in this regard, and I think others need to about showcasing the good that politics does. If you talk to someone who's been to their MP with a tricky issue, I would say 9 times out of 10 they'll come back with a glowing report. They did this for me. This is what they did. This is what they achieved. Yet it's so hard to get that out there in the midst of everything else that's going on. And it's often not in anyone's interest to do it, because you're constantly thinking about getting my side in power rather than how do I bolster the image of the profession, of democracy as a whole. So I'd love to see more efforts, around, there's great work which goes on in other professions, profiling the difference that it makes. How can we do that in politics too?
Thanks. And Luke was, of course, referencing there the John Smith Centre Power Hour series, where we take different politicians from different political parties and explore their political journey, learning about their early years, their current work and their hopes and ambitions for the future. There's a back catalogue of 12 Power Hours available for people to work their way through on our website. So thank you for the opportunity to plug that, Luke. Turning to you, Conleth, just on this question around making political candidates more representative. Again, this is a bread and butter issue for people who are engaged in the issues we're talking about today all of the time. And very often what we mean by that, I think, is looking specifically at the representation of candidates across the equality characteristics, protected characteristics. So we advocate for more women in politics, we advocate for more people with disabilities, people from different ethnic minorities, and so on. Is that what we mean here about more representative political candidates? Or actually are we talking about things which aren't in the Equality Act, things like class, that people want to see people from proper working class backgrounds, from trades, from a variety of different industries and vocations, people with caring experience, both of young children and elderly parents, for example? What do we mean by representative political candidates in this context?
I think our findings from what the British public expect of this is both and rather than either or. So it's a both the protected characteristics in the Equalities Acts across the 4 nations. And there's been progress that's been made on that in recent years. And there's definitely a story of progress that's unfinished progress, but still progress compared from where we've come from. And what the people in the groups that we were speaking with and in the polling want is that progress on more diversity in terms of measured by progress in terms of the Equality Act is backed up with these experiences that you were talking about. So experience life, or diversity of life experience, and then also people who are really rooted in their communities, who they can feel closer to, who they can feel more easy. It's more easy for them then to go with an issue like Luke was talking about the MP surgeries. It's easier to go with those issues if they feel that someone is really rooted in their community. So I think that's the kind of representativeness that we found in over the last year.
And Luke, I appreciate you have to leave us in a second or two, because you're going straight live onto Times Radio to talk about the work that you're doing, so people can tune into that immediately after this event. Now, I wonder, before you could go, whether you might be able to address a question from our audience. A guy called James has asked, as someone who isn't a member of a political party, what do you think is the best way of attempting to persuade politicians and parties to make positive change happen?
And that's such a good question. And I think it is about making your views known to them. I think it's about taking opportunities to engage with elected representatives, make clear if we had. Again, it's that sort of paradox that those of us, and I think we are the majority, who want a more civil, less polarised politics, tend not to be the people that then write in on hot button issues. So MPs' postbags or MSPs' postbags or council books are disproportionately the angrier broadly. So actually, if those of us who want to see a better tone and tenor of public life and debate were more, were perhaps more vocal about that, I think that would start to make a real difference there. That's just one step, but definitely something that I actually think we need to give more thought to, perhaps across both our organisations. What can people do to shift this? So it's not just us expecting of elites and politicians, but actually leading something from the bottom up as well.
Brilliant, a really positive place to end the conversation. Luke, Conleth, thank you so much for the work that you've done on this report with your co-authors, and for sharing its insights and findings with us today. As I said at the start, this session has been recorded, so if you want to catch up on some of the detail that you saw today, you'll be able to watch this again at the turn of next week. You'll find that on johnsmithcentre.com. And can I say to our audience, thank you for watching. If you're doing so live, please take a moment to complete the evaluation form, which is about to appear on your screen and then arrive in your inbox. There's no avoiding it. It really does help us shape future events. So thank you for the time you're going to take in filling that out. Please also take a moment to sign up for the John Smith Centre newsletter so that you can be the first to know about our future events. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.